name is Harold Davis. I'm here to teach you about the art and craft of digital photography.
Good morning and welcome to the Harold Davis Studio in Berkeley, California. We're so happy to have all of you here today. My name is Phyllis Davis and I will be your moderator and co-host today. This webinar is the making of creative garden photography. For today's webinar, we have two amazing speakers. We have Harold Davis, photographer extraordinaire, and we have Ted Waite, associate publisher from Rocky Nook. I'll start by introducing Harold. Many of you know who Harold is, but if you're joining us for the first time today, here's a little bit about him. Harold Davis is the developer of a unique technique for photographing flowers for transparency, the creator of multi-raw processing and hand HDR processing. He is a Moab master and a Zeiss ambassador. Harold is an internationally known photographer and a sought-after workshop leader. His website is digitalfieldguide.com. And today we have a special guest panelist, Ted Waite, associate publisher at Rocky Nook. Ted has been at Rocky Nook since 2015, and before Rocky Nook, he worked in the publishing industry at Peach Pit Press and Pearson's for over 10 years. He revels in the creative process and art of bookmaking, from building the foundation of the author relationship to the title concept to the craft of writing, editing, and holding the printed piece in hand. Ted is an avid photographer who enjoys capturing scenes while exploring San Francisco and Marin County. Now, I'm going to hand this webinar over to Harold and Ted.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen in a moment, but first I want to make a shout out to both Phyllis and to Ted Waite. This is really a team. No book like this that is as extensive and long and covers as many different things as creative garden photography is a solo endeavor. So I want to shout out to the team. Phyllis is in every sense my co-author, and she ought to be up here with me, but she prefers to be represented as a flower. She and I made the photographs, I'll admit to that, but she is every sense a co-author of the book as well as the book's designer. So I could not do this without her, and she should be acknowledged for it. And Ted is here to represent the team of the publisher, which is multiple people, and anything you know about publishing should tell you what an accomplishment it is for a company like Rocky Nook to put out the beautiful books, beautiful and useful books that they do. I also, before I get started with my slideshow, I want to pull out a couple of page proofs. So here's a page proof. This came from the printer of what the inside of this book is going to look like. Just to give you an idea of what goes on behind the scenes with a book like this, there's a massive amount of work involved. And thank you, Ted, for all the work you and everybody else at Rocky Nook does to help make this such a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. And I can't wait to hold the physical copy in my hand. That, I think, is in some ways the moment of truth, when you get that book and open it up and smell the ink and see the beautiful images. And
it's real. It becomes real, right?
It becomes real.
Yeah.
So,
well, thanks for having me, by the way. And of course, someone should acknowledge your part too.
Well, yeah, that happens.
The two of you have created a beautiful book, and we're really proud to be publishing it. So thank you.
Okay, I'm going to, without too much further ado, share my screen. So you won't see me, but you'll rather see my screen. And this is the making of creative garden photography. So we're going to show this presentation in a couple of different pieces. And Originally, I have been teaching garden photography as a living workshop in gardens with sessions where people photograph gardens. They come back and then we critique the photos. We talk about how to be creative in one's own way, what composition and things like that, and also how you understand the sense of place in a garden. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to show the presentation that I usually kick off those pre-pandemic workshops with. So I called my general presentation for garden photography a sense of place. So here's the sort of story within the story here. And once again, this is the cover of the beautiful book that will be coming out from Rocky Nook. And I want to highlight the subtitle of this book: Making Great Photos of Flowers, Gardens, Landscapes, and the Beautiful World Around Us. The reason that this is important to me is that this is not just a book about landscape architecture and setting your tripod down in a garden. It's about much more than that, ranging from the macro world to how you treat lighting of landscapes. This is a controversial approach to take, believe it or not, from the world of professional garden photographers, some of whom feel that you don't really have any business photographing the details of flowers up close if you're doing garden photography, because presumably you can take pictures of a flower anywhere right at home. You don't need to go to a beautiful garden in some other part of the world to photograph a flower. And likewise with the big picture, well, if it's a landscape anyhow, what is that necessarily gardens? But I decided back, and Ted had some influence on this, I decided back a while ago to also create this book about how you take the garden inside and how you photograph intimate landscapes related to a garden, as well as how you do the big picture of the garden. After all, gardens have long been part of human iconography and history, dating, from the book of Genesis and various other places. And gardens are such a special part of things. They can be big, they can be small. Why be narrow in one's definition of what a garden is? So when you approach our book, please approach it as a book that is as broad as possible about the idea of what a garden is. We'll be showing this link a couple of more times, but on the Rocky Nook site, and you don't really need to know the full address that's up there, you just need to go to Rocky Nook and look and search for garden photography. You'll find our book. You can pre-order the hard copy. The ebook is ready now. And as Phyllis said, there's a great deal on the Rocky Nook site where you can get the ebook and the print bundle for really only a few dollars more than just the book. I've kind of recommend it because I've had lots of students say to me, we love having your books on our devices because we can use them in the field. But at the same time, there's nothing like the real book, and we've worked very hard to make this a very beautiful book with 1 foot in the technical book camp and 1 foot in the art book camp. So consider taking advantage of that. The discount code that will get you a 40% discount is GARDEN40. What is a garden? So I've been talking about that a little bit, but the definition of a garden is something that has a lot of discussion about it. In the Japanese culture, people like gardens that bring in elements from outside the physical place, and there's a very formal aspect to it. But if you look at something like this potentially extremely ugly industrial scene, you could say, well, that's a kind of garden. It's a garden of industry. So gardens can be very metaphoric, or this dragon in the Anza Borrego Desert that a sculptor erected there, shown here at sunrise. That's a very different kind of garden. And on my light box, I call this image the Garden of Spring's Delight. So I made a garden inside in the way that you can see me do light box work for gardens. Or this is a single flower in Giverny a single tulip with a drop of water on it, photographed with a very low depth of field, so the background becomes nice and rich. And in some ways, the sense of place comes through in the single flower, as it does also in this Camellia japonica, shot in a horticultural background, in a horticultural nursery garden, but isolated so that you don't see the background. It's just a flower in place. And I myself like to think of the wilderness as the greatest garden of all. This is a view at sunset from the summit of Lembert Dome in Tuolumne Meadows above Yosemite, in Yosemite National Park. And the Yosemite Valley floor, a place that was inspiration for Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed some of the great landscape gardens in the United States. A row of trees planted primarily for functional reasons as a windbreak on Point Reyes creates a great sense of garden. And again, rows of trees here in Tuscany are also gardens. Is the great Jem El Fna in Marrakesh, where people have come for trading and camel caravans, and now caravans of tourists, or at least when they're allowed to travel there again. Is that a garden? Urban gardens? It's hard to know what is a garden and what isn't a garden. So gardens can be thought of as a place where you understand what is good and what is evil. Is there a pattern to your garden? Is the garden a public place like a park, or is it a private place, a rich person's garden, or even my little postage stamp of a garden, which is my private place that I go to be peaceful and to grow things? And what's the difference between a weed and a flower, a weed and a plant? I love to photograph, bad boy plants that are officially weeds, and but they're just as beautiful. If you don't tell them they're a weed, they like it very much. The dandelion, it's the bane of gardeners. People spend money and a lot of effort to get rid of them in their garden, but they're great, symmetrical, and beautiful. Or like this Papaver somniferum, opium poppy. And the thing about it is that it looks here as though it were a sea creature looking at you from above rather than a flower. Another great wilderness scene. This is Sondong Cavern, the world's largest cave somewhere in the jungle in Vietnam near the Laotian border. It's so big that it has water systems and rivers of its own, but looking at it kind of from a distance as a landscape, it too is a garden. And a garden in middle of Vietnam, or a lake in Maine. Are these all gardens? I like to think so. Cottage garden. This is the purpose of all Zen teaching, to make you wonder and answer that wondering with the deepest expression of your own nature. So I've shown some wild gardens. There are gardens, say Versailles, that is just a status symbol to say, Versailles says, I'm Louis XIV, great and powerful. Look on me and despair, and nobody else will have a garden like this. They're gardens that are intended for eating. Right now we have a vegetable bed going with tomatoes, lettuce, squash, all kinds of things. They're healing gardens. Used to be a big thing. A monastery would always have a garden with herbs and plants that helped one recover. But they're memory gardens. Gardens like certain kinds of cemeteries have examples of that. For instance, here's an herb garden. This garden is a commercial place that does biologic things like skin creams and verbena and so on. Verbena shown there. The French garden is a very formalized with grids and crisscrosses the garden in Loire, the Villandry garden in the Loire Valley is perhaps the most, I don't know, egregious example of this. You either love it or you hate it, but it is certainly geometric. And in the book, there's a short section on the famous gardener, André Le Nôtre. The question is, if your father and grandfather were gardeners to the king, what do you do in your life? Well, you become a gardener yourself. And many of the greatest gardens in France, all of them pretty much, were started by André Le Nôtre, who is the founder of this school of gardening, of repetition and rows in an organized way. So a lot of what we love when we go to France and see the French countryside stems from the garden ideas that back in the 17th century, André Le Nôtre came up with. So Japanese gardens have more of a concept, a holistic concept of sitting back and enjoying nature and then recreating it. Shown here, the pattern, the garden pattern in the gravel is a rainstorm, metaphorically, where the round circles are drops of water falling into a pond during a cloudy day. And you can see also in the image the shadow of the temple behind it, shown here a little bigger. And the old, it's almost like partly you let things go to age in a wabi-sabi kind of way in the Japanese garden, but it's all very intentional and planned. This is a image I made at in Nachi-san, at the terminus of the Kumano-Kodo pilgrimage trail on the inland sea of Japan. And then, so when we think of a cottage garden, this is an English style garden with sort of an intimacy and, again, a different kind of trained wildness. And sometimes it's not the flowers that make a garden. This simple wood bench photographed outside the wall of the Aldrich Rockefeller Garden in near Seal Harbor, Maine. For me, some of my peak garden experiences have been in Monet's garden in Giverny. There are a few photographs from the lily pond side of Giverny. There's a sense for me that when I was a kid, I spent time in the water lily room in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and that, along with the Ansel Adams photographs that were in their collection and exhibited at that point, were part of what set me on the life path that I've been on. So every time I've been to Giverny, it's been really a splendid experience for me. There are two sides to the garden that were originally split by a train track. These days, there's a submerged road and a subterranean passage you go between the two. So this is the upper part of the garden that's more like a normal garden. And this is the lower one with the famous green paint and the bridges. Another Japanese style bridge. This one in the garden at Schwetzingen Palace in Baden-Wertheim in Germany. So I like to say that photography is applied design, and this is, of course, this is obviously true in the sense that when you present a photograph, you're presenting something with a frame around it in 2 dimensions. So the idea of putting the world into that is an issue of 3-dimensional design being reduced to 2. So in much the same way, a garden is taking a 3-dimensional space and creating something that's designed around it, as in these arcades in various parts of the world. Or perhaps something as informal as this sort of, I'm not quite sure how to describe it, this ad hoc garden created in the wall, in a very, very old wall along the Camino Portuguese in Galicia in Spain. This is a private garden with echoes of Japanese in Camden, Maine. And this is a garden created inside Photoshop. So we're looking here at images that I created using a light box and the techniques of digital painting and post-production. So I want to say that it's important that we understand that my book explains how to use these techniques to create images of your own. Just as garden design is imposing order on nature, can you impose order on nature? Sometimes nature bites back. This is what I like to call my spider web studio, because photographing water drops with extreme macros, you need some way to keep the water drops still. So what I encouraged a spider to grow webs in a place where I could put flowers underneath. And then when it rained, I had a spider web studio with the, I guess, daisy shown there. And here's a flower cut away to show the inside. So a garden of this sort is order imposed on nature in two different ways, with the pattern of flowers and the pattern of the photographic design with the line around it, and the peonies here. When you take a camera into a garden, how are you going to capture the soul of the garden? What is the soul of the garden? One of the things in creative garden photography that we do is we present a couple of checklists that you can use as reference. When you go into the garden, what should you be looking for? What is the kind of garden it is? What's important about this garden? And taking that information, what do you do with it? What kind of light is best? What kind of techniques should you use? What kind of camera equipment should you use? What role does chance and the passing of time have to do with it? And a camera is an extension of ourselves, an appendage that brings us closer to the universe and all nature. I have been about this and doing this for quite some time. This is a poster of one of my photographs back from the 1980s. It was quite popular for a while, and I just included it to say, okay, this is not something that has been, my life work is fundamentally a botanical and flower and garden photography. It's the kind of photography I love and like best. So some of that involves close-up photography. As William Blake put it, you can see the world in a grain of sand, and you can certainly see it in a water drop or a petal, or the magnificence that nature creates within a garden context. This image and the one that follows it are what are called fusion X-rays, where what we did, and my collaborator, Dr. Julian Kupfka, and I used an X-ray machine to photograph the flowers, and then we used a light box to create the outside, so the X-ray images combine the inside and the outside of the flowers. And then you can take a context like this and create even a more Photoshop wrapped around it. In my book, Creative Garden Photography, you'll find the techniques for working on a light box laid out in a step-by-step way, along with how to do things like creating an L-channel LAB inversion to put a light box image on black. So here are some more light box images. These are also pretty thoroughly covered in the book. I've been doing a lot of these since we started sheltering in place 115 days ago. So it's been very productive for me. We had a great season of poppies this year. They're gone now, and I'm waiting on my dahlia bed to grow so that I can grow more. I can do more. This is a field of hydrangea blossoms where the blossoms, I took the blossoms off the bigger one, put them on a light box and photographed them up close. And I call this one Paul Clay's In Wabi Sabi's Garden, because it's a sort of composition I made on the light box where I intentionally created a sense of this is not the permanence of everything here. Here's some information, and I bet Phyllis will show this toward the end of the presentation as well, where where you can figure out how to contact me. And here's the information about obtaining the book, pre-ordering the book and obtaining the ebook now. The discount code again is Garden40. Let me also note that the ebook versions that you can get off when you buy it from the publisher at Rocky Nook do include versions that you can use on the Kindle as well. So I'm going to go ahead and open up some of the pages of the book, particularly the table of contents. Give me a minute to figure out how to do that. While I'm navigating back and forth, do we have any questions that might be relevant, Phyllis?
Oh, yes, we do. Ronald wants to know, in a few photos, there is a chop in the corner of the image. What does it say and where was it created?
Well, Phyllis, why don't you answer that question?
Well, you can say what it, I actually.
Okay. Yeah. So this is what's called an inken. It's a hand stamp with an ink pad. There are various forms of it in various different countries, in China and Japan. This is a Japanese chop, which is normally used as apart from anything else, as a formal signature for legal documents. I've had the experience traveling the world with my camera of many people asking me, what kind of photographer are you? So I got a little tired of answering it, honestly. People would say, well, do you photograph weddings? Are you a jewelry photographer? And I've been lucky enough to figure out a way where I can photograph what I want and make a living out of it. So I finally said, no, what I am is a poet. I'm a photographer as poet. So that's what it says. It says photographer as poet, more or less. And at first I was a little worried. Phyllis and I commissioned it from someone who makes inkens, and I was a little worried. Does it really say that? I've been told a couple of times it does by people who should know.
Here's hoping.
Here's hoping.
Curtis would like to know, what is a wabi-sabi garden?
Yeah, wabi-sabi is the Japanese aesthetic concept that there is beauty in decay, that things stay beautiful as they mature and get older, that it's not just about that first flush of beauty when one's a teenager and young adult, but that flowers are just as beautiful as they go on to become more mature and they get, like me, a few wrinkles and gray hairs and things. So time passing is thought to be one of the key functions of art and beauty, is to show time passing and that which is beautiful going through the full stages of life, not just the initial stage.
And a few garden suggestions here. Joe suggests that you should visit China sometime for the Chinese garden. It is different and beautiful.
I'd like to. And that's easy. Yes, sign me up. Next time I can get on an airplane, whatever that is.
And Richard says, have you visited the Butchart Gardens near Victoria, BC?
I have a long time ago, but there's some place I'd really like to go back because they're first rate.
And Aparna asks, which gardens in the Bay Area are your favorites?
Yeah, in the Bay Area, Filoli is a great garden. Of course, the Golden Gate Park in San Francisco has some wonderful gardens. Locally here, a lesser known garden is Blake Garden in Kensington, California, which is a teaching garden for the landscape architecture program of UC Berkeley. Open to the public weekdays from, I think, 10 to 4, and it's small, but it's quite, maybe 10 acres, but it's quite wonderful. So those are some ideas. Also, let me mention the two botanic gardens in Berkeley. There's the one that's part of UC Berkeley, which is quite wonderful, but basically a conventional botanical garden. And then there's the native plant botanic garden in Tilden Park, which was, I forget the person's name, but there was a landscape architect person whose baby it was for maybe 100 years or something, 50 years, maybe literally. And it's got all these waterfalls. Visit it sometime in rainy season here. It's a stupendously fun place.
And Kathy's asking, what does the light box look like? I'm going to put in a link to Amazon for the light pads that Harold uses for his light box photography.
And what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to switch over to run through a couple of points on the table of contents here for the book. So, you know, I spend a lot of time in my slideshow, and when I do this as a class, in a living class, I spend a fair amount of time on discussions of what is a garden and garden design. In the book itself, it's like 40 pages. We kept it short and sweet. So the next section, photographing the garden at large, is a major section of the book, and there's a fair amount of technical information: how you deal with white balance, how you deal with lighting, understanding reflectivity, what's the best tripod to use, exposure, aperture, depth of field, creative exposure, how you might use a camera in motion to do things, that kind of thing. Then the idea of the next section, and Ted, you have some responsibility for this, because basically you said to me, Harold, if you're going to put a lightbox image on the cover of the book, you better tell people how to do it. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. Yeah. There's going to be an expectation.
Right. There's going to be a reckoning if you don't do that. So
that's right. That's right. I'm really happy that's covered in the book.
I am too. I mean, for me, at first I was a little resistant to it, but as I began to do it, it seemed to me this is really the time and place to tell this, because it's such an important part of garden photography, I think, for me and generally as well. And as it turned out, in this era of people having to stay closer to home, there's some real fringe benefits to it. In any case, the taking the garden close up and inside is maybe a third of the book, and what it shows is how you do lightbox photography, how you photograph on black, what tools you need for doing macro and extreme close-up photography, how you auxiliarily light things, and various things like that. There's a section on focus stacking, and there's a section on photographing water drops, and also on how you photograph small garden critters. The back end of the book, the resources section, lists most of the gardens photographed in the book, as well as a glossary of botanical terms and photographic terms, and an explanation of how sensor size fits into all of this, as well as where to go for more information. I think Phyllis also mentioned that one of the things we did was we included full capture information for every photo in the book. And there are a lot of photographs in this book. I don't think we've counted them, but probably 200 to 300. There's one photo. I leave it as a treasure hunt to find the photo that does not have caption information. I'm going to just start flipping through some of the pages to give you some idea of what's in here as I go, without stopping to comment too much, unless anybody has any questions about specific pages. When I say that there's technical caption information on every photo, if you look down, for example, on this one on the right, you'll see that the information about the photo, which is sort of in a different type font than the regular font, is broken into a couple of different sections. So at the bottom is the information of the camera, the lens used, and the exposure. And then above it is the story behind it, why I took this, what I was thinking, what you might think in a comparable section. The bust here is André Lenotte, the originator of the French School of Garden Design. Phyllis, since you did such a wonderful and beautiful design of this book, would you care to say a few things about what your thinking was and how you achieved this rather incredible piece of design?
Oh, thank you so much. My thing with designing books for you, Harold, is always to stay out of the way of your photographs. That's sort of my key thing, is I don't want anything that's too bright, too busy, too anything that's going to draw the eye away from a photograph. Because what's the most important thing in these books for me are the beautiful images. I love designing these books with beautiful images on every page. It's amazing.
Well, you're really sweet, but
it's true. No, it's true. So I keep all the colors muted. Like there's the blue that's pretty gentle there. The yellow is gentle. There's sort of like a gray accent kind of thing, but it's all really pretty monochrome, pretty quiet, because I just love the photos and I don't want to take away from them.
Well, I want to point out that just as good garden design gets out of the way of the garden and the landscape, good book design also gets out of the way of the content of the book. And it's not just the photographs, it's the instructional content too. The way you've done something, for example, like this figure here showing effective light intensity, side lighting, or some of the other things like the lists, makes it easy to get what I'm talking about and what the content of the book is. So how you would figure out light direction and what the and this kind of thing. In other words, form follows function, and that's true for garden design, for photographic design, and for book design. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Here's the fundamental law of reflection. I love that one. Ted, you want to jump in on the topic of book design? What do you look for in book design generally?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I probably, just to reiterate what you're both saying, a lot of the times the best thing, and from an editorial perspective, even in addition, is the best thing to do is to know when to insert yourself and when to get out of the way, because everything is just working so well. And I feel like this book design does a similar thing. There's elegance and straightforwardness and beautiful simplicity can look really simple, but it can be deceptively difficult to achieve. And when between the photographs, the instruction itself, and the design all come together and just create a seamless reading and enjoying experience, that's you've hit it. You've hit your mark.
And Roy has a question actually. Creative Black and White was a marvelous learning journey showing the art and including Photoshop recipes for processing. Can we expect something similar in the Creative Garden book?
Hi, Roy. I think I think the answer is yes, but the mix is a little bit different. I mean, with Creative Black and White, which, by the way, you can also find on the Rocky Nook website, message from our sponsor. So the mix there, it was, okay, a third, why is black and white important in the digital era? How do you go and find a good black and white photo? What's a black and white photo about? A third, how you process a color image to black and white. And a third, what are creative techniques afterwards? So maybe that's a book that's 2/3 Photoshop and 1/3 photography. The mix here is probably closer to 50-50. There's more photography involved in this book, since there's photography is the more important component of garden photography, relatively speaking. I mean, I'm a great believer that I love Photoshop, and I'm a great believer. Here's some of the Lightbox material in my book, by the way, as I'm flipping through the pages. I'm a great believer that the art of digital photography is 1 part photography and 1 part post-production. But that said, if you can get it right in the camera, you should. So more of this book is about getting it right in the camera, but definitely there are recipes. I hope that answers the question. I think that it's a hard thing to answer without seeing the mixture of the book, but I always believe in telling people how to do something, not so much from the point of view of a recipe as from the point of view of how do you achieve how do you become a more creative, more insightful, better photographer yourself? As a teacher, my key goal is to help you become better in your work, not to help you do exactly what I do. On the other hand, it just happened to open this page, inverting a white background to black. Well, you can see that there's 6 steps there for how to do it. And similarly, here's some more steps. So, I think the real answer to your question is yes. Are there any other questions, Phyllis?
Yeah, there's actually a request to flip slower.
Well, the best way to flip slower is to get your own copy.
And Linda would like to know, do you ever use mirrors in your flower photography?
Absolutely. In fact, Mir is going to play a key role in the three-dimensional lightbox photography webinar that's coming up on Saturday. And I think what I'd actually like to do at this point is to open up the web page of our coming up live webinars. And this is the live webinars page on digitalfieldguide.com, our website. And each of these webinars has a detail page that you can get to like that. So here's lightbox photography in 3 dimensions. And this we'll be showing how to create lightbox images of things like bouquets of flowers, as well as things that are not flat on the light box, using either 2 light boxes done perpendicularly or a mirror and a light box. But yeah, I love photographing on mirrors. On Saturday, July 18th, another free webinar, and this one I'll be talking about my experiences walking on the pilgrimage trails in Galicia. We have a Photoshop webinar on July 30th, multi-raw processing. On September 3rd, we're going to do how to create HDR photos by hand, not using automated HDR software, another Photoshop webinar. One of my favorite nature photographers, William Neal, and I will be presenting our work in our books. As it happens, Bill has a beautiful book that Rocky Nook is also publishing that's coming out, and we'll be doing that on September 5th. I have a photography on black webinar on the 12th. I do have a relationship with Moab Paper, part of Legion Paper, where they help make it possible for Phyllis and me to do the fine art printing that we do. And so 2 other Moab masters, Scott Barrow and Jim Graham, and the director of marketing for Moab, Mark Shotland, the 4 of us will be presenting on printmaking and everything you always wanted to know about how to make prints on September 24th. And that is a paid webinar, but it benefits Equal Justice Initiative, so it's a good cause. And I've got a master photography panel that I'll be moderating with the great photographers Jennifer King and Alan Shapiro on October 10th, where again we benefit the NAACP. We're going to show how to photograph bottle light, meaning how do you take a bottle, put some food color in it, and photograph it with sunlight coming through to create abstractions. Let me show the detail page on that one, so that you can get some idea of what I'm talking about there. Yeah, so these 2 images that you see on the screen they look like some kind of landscape or something, but actually they're a low depth of field image of a food color coming through with sunlight coming through a bottle. Very simple to set up. As somebody who saw an early version of this webinar said, I never expected to see Betty Crocker food colors in a how-to photography session. It's a fun technique, can be done at home with totally minimal equipment. I like minimal equipment. I'm really not that much of a, photography has 2 mothers really in some ways. One is the people who have always been tinkerers and gadgeteers, and without them, we never would have progressed to where we are technically. But it's also a artistic and creative pursuit that owes more to painters, say Monet and Cézanne, than it does to discussions of what kind of lens to use. And really, as a photographer, one needs to be comfortable with both sides of it. And then finally, later in the autumn, I have another master photographer column with 2 panel with 2 great photographers, Anne Belmont and Brian Peterson, also benefiting a good cause. So Phyllis, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, if I can figure out how to do that. And let's open it up to discussions generally.
Okay, great. I've been typing away furiously here. People have been asking questions. And let's see, oh, I have to put up the link for the MOA website. Lots of links I need to put up. Actually, after this webinar, why don't I send out an email to everyone? I'll just be BCC everyone with all the links and everything going by so fast in the chat box today. So eventually I'll get an email out to everyone. So that'll make it nice.
And also, I'll send out a invitation to my email list to everybody who registered for here. And also, if the automation works as it's supposed to work, and fingers crossed, everyone should also get the Rocky Nook link and discount code in an email in the next day or two.
So where would you like to start?
Ask me something juicy. Ask
questions.
Ask Ted something juicy.
I've got something for you, Harold.
Excellent.
Just out of curiosity, I've got a two-parter that I was just kind of writing down as you went through the presentation. One is on Lightbox work, and kind of do you go through periods where you kind of obsessively do Lightbox work as the main thing, or is it always part of a mix that's kind of always in process? That may even be a larger
it is a larger question. It's a great question, and I've sort of been studying myself as a meta issue. It's very strange. It's very strange because I go through these intense periods of infatuation with something, and it runs its course. It's kind of like a fever. And yes, that's like every day, Lightbox. Oh my God, what can I do next? And do it. And then I don't want to see it.
You burned out on it for a little bit. I burned
out on it for a while, and it's more like that for me than yes. And that's exactly what it's like.
And do you think that if that then creates a certain set of cycles, do you think that you can, when you look back, do you see that the last time I went, whole hog on Lightbox work, and then let it sit for a while, I had some perhaps revelation or epiphany might be a strong word, but do you feel yourself each kind of sequential time kind of pulling something from the last session?
That's another good question, Ted. I mean, yes is the answer there. I do, but it's not an epiphany often. It's like, okay, why didn't I try that? But it's also something else that, look, I have been doing this a while. And there's this weird sense in which your photographs from a certain era are a time capsule of that era. And, for example, I have a Monochromatic Visions portfolio that we made, I think, 6 or 7 years ago. It was in a limited edition of maybe 12 copies. And recently someone just contacted me out of the blue and said, do you have any of those left? I want one. So we had to look through it and make it. And these are good photos. I still like them. I'm happy with them, but they're not what I'm doing now. And they're different. And, probably we'll do a second Monochromatic Visions portfolio. As bringing that up made me say, okay, let me do a second one. I think the Lightbox work I did this spring is as good as any of the Lightbox work I've ever done. Some of it's even better at the top of it, but it's like anything else. Part of the art of photography is to be a good editor, because you can easily throw out thousands, hundreds of thousands of images. In fact, most of us probably do. But how do you pick the good ones, and which ones remain through time? There's a certain percolating up process that, of what I photographed in 2008, some small percentage stay in the top 100, but it gets harder and harder for it to percolate up as you go. There is the other question of, what does the world say? Which ones get used? Which ones get licensed? Which ones have dealers requests for, that kind of thing? If somebody, I probably field a couple of image requests a week, basically. And so there's some information from which ones get requested, which ones get picked out of selections, that kind of thing, that's beyond my own sense of it. And of course, everything I do really is in collaboration with Phyllis, so she has a lot to say about that also. The kids too these days, but My oldest is always saying to me, Harold, why don't you photograph this? Why don't you photograph that? Sometimes I'm like, okay, you photograph it, but
Director.
but that hasn't happened yet. Great questions, though. I like them. Thanks.
Oh, thanks for answering them.
And we have a question for Ted. How long does it take to publish a book from like initial concept to holding it in your hand?
Oh, that's a good question. That also a good question. It really depends. I think probably the easiest and cleanest answer is usually from the time that a book's manuscript is submitted. It's somewhere in the vicinity of 5 to 6 months, where you generally speaking, every book is different, but generally speaking, a book will take perhaps a month to edit, a month or so to lay out, and then you go to press, and that's, if you're printing overseas, for example, it may be the better part of 3 months before the book publishes. So 5 to 6 months from the time the manuscript is submitted, and then everything before that is really dependent on what the author's schedule. And sometimes books take 2 months to write, believe it or not. Sometimes books take 10 years. I heard you say, this book, from our involvement at Rocky Nook, was about a year from the initial conversations about the book to public till going to press. But behind the scenes, books are happening all the time. And like you said, you've spent the last decade, more or less, in some version or another working on this book. So it really can depend. But probably about a year is a good whole number.
So I see a couple of questions going by. As Ted said, we signed the contract for this book about a year ago. I think literally you said almost exactly a year ago. Mm-hmm. So in some sense, I've been working on it all my life. So
Correct.
That means at least 21 years. That's a joke, but
well, well, I believe it's the polisher from Pentagram Design. She when Citibank and Travelers Insurance was coming together, and she was tasked with coming up with a logo for the new company, she did it in the initial meeting, and it took 30 seconds. And somebody said, I can't believe we're paying you for 30 seconds of work. And she said, well, it's about 40 years and 30 seconds.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how it works,
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, so I see a question coming in that maybe you can answer, Ted, because I can't. Is the binding stitched or glued? My experience of the books coming out of Rocky Nook is that the quality of the binding is excellent. I haven't had any fall apart on me.
Yeah, I can't answer that specifically for this book right now. We do some stitching and some gluing, depending on the book. But we too do a lot of printing in some in China, some in Korea, some domestically, and generally speaking, we get good results. There's always an occasional issue, of course, being physical things, but yeah, we've had a good run on binding in general, so we have no concerns there. But
yeah,
I understand.
I don't see that as a concern.
If you've seen if you've had a bad experience, I understand the concern.
Yeah, I wouldn't work with, if they did bad bindings, I wouldn't work with them. Terrible. There you go. It's important. The book is going to be very nicely produced. It's got these wonderful flaps. It's very cool. It's kind of understated though. It's not like over the top. Mm-hmm. I see a couple of questions rolling through here. Do I do supplemental lighting in the garden? Yes, I do sometimes, and some of that's discussed in the book. I use diffusers and reflectors and sometimes external auxiliary strobe lighting in the garden, sure. But the most important thing with lighting is to learn to observe light. If you know how to see it, then you can figure out how to capture it. But if you can't see it, you're like a blind person. There's no, you've lost 2 strikes from the get-go or something, to mix my metaphors terribly. But, and one thing I like to say that's helpful there, for me at least, is to understand that as a matter of physics, you cannot actually photograph an object. All you can photograph is the light reflected or emitted by objects. So follow the light. It's the key thing. I also see the question of what design software does Phyllis use to do the design? And the answer there is InDesign, which is sort of the industry standard for this kind of thing. I also see a question about the ebooks that whether it's scalable for people with eyesight issues, and my understanding is that the answer is yes there. That in fact it is. Ted, that's right.
Yeah, I can jump in there and say that Rocky Nook really is, if you're into ebooks, I'm not trying to do a hard push here, but if you're into ebooks, Rocky Nook is the place to get them, because you will get all three, what we call flavors or file types of ebooks that you can download at any time, forever. And you get the PDF, so you have the design integrity of the printed book, and then you also have an EPUB file and a MOBI file in case you want to load it onto your Kindle or Kindle app. That's where you can scale up and down, change the fonts, types, and sizes as well.
And there's an FAQ on the Rocky Nook website as to how to do that. There's no real problem with doing it. It's easy, but there are instructions for how to do it. How much time do I spend in a garden to photograph it? As much as I can. I mean, seriously, part of it is you go there and you sit for a while and you explore it. And as I say in the book, in the checklist for what you do when you go to a new garden, you try to figure out the plan of the garden in a high place where you can see, where you can get a vista and see what it's about. I like my intimate relationships to be fulfilling and not fly by night, so to speak. So that goes for gardens. Take your time.
That's one of the best parts, or one of the parts of the book I really enjoy a lot, is the one where you're talking about what you're looking for when you're walking in. Because if you're a novice, it's extremely helpful, and if you've been shooting gardens for a long time, it's a great refresher. Those ideas of where are the portals, where's the light in relation to the portal, all that stuff is really, if you don't know where to start, those offer these great places to start and start to kind of piece it all together.
Thanks. That's important to me as a part of the book. That was a part I enjoyed most and helped clarify some of my thinking about it. Do you grow your own flowers to photograph, or do you work with a florist? Yes. I prefer working with stuff that I've grown. Okay, that's my absolute preference, particularly with something like poppers, poppies, and tulips and flowers like that. You just can't get the varieties from a florist that will work, not in a timely way. But I have enjoyed working with some really good florists as well. I see a question for you, Ted. Do you post to Europe?
Yeah, we have international shipping. Mm-hmm. And we also have, for what it's worth, we have international distribution as well. So you can order from Rocky Nook, but you can also, it might take a little bit more time to get out to other places outside the US, but we have worldwide distribution as well.
What would you recommend to somebody, let's say they're in Germany or France? Well, there's a possibility that the book will be translated too, but as some
there is. Yeah, well, we go to two, generally speaking, outside of the craziness of this year, we go to 2 book fairs per year. We go to the London Book Fair in the spring, and we go to Frankfurt in the fall, and that's where we work with other publishing partners to get foreign rights deals and translations underway. It's hard to say right now. I would say if you're keen to get it and place the pre-order, go for it and have it, order it directly from Rocky Nook. But if you, the one challenge I can confess to is, we don't have the best tracking information for international shipping. It will get there, but if that's really important to you, then you might want to hold off.
Phyllis, a question I see for you. What draws you to the square format?
Well, it seems to work well. Publishers seem to keep suggesting it. And so it's a collaboration when you're making a book. What does the publisher want to do for a specific size? What do we want to do? Does it fit? I mean, the 9-inch by 9-inch format is really great because you get, it's literally 9 inches high, obviously, but it's 18 inches wide. So you get this big, wide real estate. So you have room for the image plus a room for a couple columns of text. So it works out pretty well with the dimensionality of your photos.
I find myself sometimes a little frustrated with it as a format because, of course, it's not really the same format as a full frame DSLR produces, which is 1.5 to 1. So that means that sometimes I do crop my photos square anyhow, like the one that Phyllis is using as her avatar right now, but but it can be a little frustrating because you either, if you're going to reproduce the full frame of the photo, you're going to either be pushed against one side a little bit, or you're going to have it in the middle and have a lot of blank space around it, or you're going to crop the photo, right, Phyllis? One of the three. Mm-hmm. And I had the complaint. I've had the complaint from art directors about my work that I cropped them so well to start with that there's no room to put type over anything. Yeah, because I don't really care about putting type on them. That's right. But this can lead to a problem with the square format. But, I guess what I really want is to do a 30-inch by 40-inch book sometime. Right, Ted?
Of course. With extra fold outs and all that good stuff.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's not a problem. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we'll do it tomorrow.
Hey, as long as people are, there's a certain, there's a certain math that works there. But,
Now, Phyllis is a great designer. In many ways, she makes these things work by kind of like magic.
Well, that's one of the great experiences of the book, looking at the PDF is just, and knowing what will happen with the printed piece as well, is when you're kind of in the book and you're working your way through it and you're reading it and enjoying the imagery, is sometimes you'll flip a page and there's just a 2-page spread of one, really beautiful image. I mean, and as Phyllis said, that's 18 by 9. That's a large image you're being presented with in a book, and it's really beautiful.
Thanks. Harold, there seems to be a lot of flower questions here about flattening petals, light boxes, all those things. I've been directing people to the photographing flowers for transparency webinars that we have up on YouTube, because there's a lot of that in there. And anything you have to add to it?
Well, I think that's a good place to go for information on it. But I also think this book has a lot of information on it. So I think I've synthesized in a fairly step-by-step and bite-sized way what I do. Take a workshop with me. I mean, seriously, it's not really possible right now, I'm afraid. But once it is, that's the best way to learn this for real. Up until we had to cancel the workshop this year in June, but up until this, we've been doing a photographing flowers for transparency in-person workshop at least once a year. And it works better because, you get to do hands-on, and it's a great, it's a great way to sort of have a room full of flowers and people who love flowers and love flower photography and work together. And it is true that in workshops, people learn as much from the other participants as from the teacher too. So I've been enjoying learning how to do webinars, and I think for both Phyllis and myself, it's been a learning curve, but it's no substitute for an in-person workshop. And I hope we're able to do them again sometime soon.
That's great. Let's see. Harold, here's another question. You seem to have created a few signature styles that you use in flower and garden photography. How do I create a unique style of my own?
This is a question I get surprisingly often in workshops from fairly advanced people who already understand a lot of how the camera works, how to process their images and have a workflow. And then they hit a certain wall and they say, well, okay, I know how to make these photos. Where do I go from here? What do I do with it from here? I want a style of my own. I want people to call me out and know me. And, there's no quick fix on this. My best suggestion is to not worry about it too much. Keep going, doing what you're doing. Remember to have beginner's mind, the sense that it's okay to try things and fail. And over time, you find a style by looking back, not by looking forward. In other words, you look at the work you've done. It relates a little to a question Ted asked me about what images that I've done and how it happens. I see my style and where I'm going with it by looking back at what I've done over the last couple of years, not by saying, okay, today I'm going to become Edward Weston or whatever. But thanks for a very interesting question there.
Yeah, Harold, I think you're always reading and looking at the old masters. I always see you with a book in your hand, exploring different styles, paintings, all sorts of different media. And you're always thinking about, how do I translate that or a piece of that to my photography and take it and make something new,
I really think that's right too, that it's important to keep looking at good work, whether you find that work on, God help us, Instagram or Flickr, or whether it is looking through, as you say, the Impressionists or painters or Expressionist flower painters or whatever it is. Also, I read a really interesting interview with Bob Dylan not so long ago, where here's an artist, and I'm a fanboy. Okay, I love Dylan, and the truth is he has kept vital over many, many, many years and through many different styles, and that's really a very, very hard thing to do. And I don't think he thinks about it very much. He just does his thing. He keeps on doing. So keeping on doing is where it's at. And as he said in this interview, I think it's in the New York Times, as he said, a lot of it is free association for him. He doesn't think too hard. Well, some of that's true for me also. Phyllis calls this serendipity, but another way to look at it is it's accessing the unconscious and being prepared to let go and trying things, a beginner's mind. These are all different terms for some of the same phenomenon where a conscious overlay doesn't work as well as letting go a bit.
That's really interesting to hear that, in context to finding a style or a voice. I feel like there's a slight metaphor to when people come to Rocky Nook, or when potential writers in general say, how do I write a bestseller? And the answer is, you can't aim directly for it. You've got to, like you said, you've got to explore. You've got to do something meaningful for you, and that's going to give you your best chance to find success, whether that success is a bestseller or that success is looking back and seeing your voice and style emerge.
That's great. I love hearing the birds, Ted. They're wonderful.
Yeah, it's quite nice here.
That's great. Irene wants to know, Ted, can you talk a bit about paper choices for this kind of a book?
Sure. Yeah, it's not quite as complicated as you might think. I know that, when people are creating, very, very, very high-end fine art coffee table art books, that there's a real, you can go down the rabbit hole on paper for sure. We, generally speaking, have a few different stocks of paper that we use. Some are more glossy, some are more matte, some are kind of a satin in between. So you're kind of talking about a finish. You're talking about the weight of paper that you're using, and it's probably similar. The answer is oddly similar to a design question. You're trying to choose a paper that kind of doesn't really call attention to itself, just presents the material as best that it can, and gets out of the way.
Ted, I want to point out that the paper used is archival and acid-free, though, so it's good paper.
Yeah, it is good. Yeah, we do pride ourselves on, even though, you know, we're not a fine art photography coffee table book publisher, we really do think that, you know, for mostly educational photography books, there's no reason they shouldn't be beautifully designed and beautifully printed. That's one of our real points of pride.
Maybe we should take like one or two more. You do a great job, Ted. I mean,
Thank you.
and I think, you know, my book is going to show that. I think from what I've seen of Bill's book, that's really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
Larry has a question if you want.
I think we should take maybe one or two more questions and maybe call it a wrap, Phyllis.
Okie doke. So Larry wants to know, some of the images in the book look like paintings or watercolor. Were those made in Photoshop?
Well, probably made in the camera and in Photoshop. I like to say that a pixel has two mothers. One is creation in Photoshop, and the other is in a camera. And also, a pixel doesn't know where it came from. If it is digital art, basically, then yes, I used Photoshop. That's my primary tool.
And Danielle says, I own lots of Rocky Nook books and love them.
Haha,
Oh,
go Danielle.
Yeah.
I see a question about whether I've led workshops in England. Not yet. I'd like to. I have in Germany, France, and Japan, but not in England yet. Invite me.
Okay, shall we end it here?
I think it's a great place, and I want to thank everyone very much. This is it's been a pleasure. Ted, thank you so much for helping us out with this and for publishing the book. I couldn't do it.
Thanks for having me. You guys really make it really easy for us. So thank you very much. It's a really beautiful book.
Well,
and everybody, thank you for joining us. And photograph gardens, photograph flowers. Be happy, stay safe, be creative. Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. Be creative and stay mighty.